Past several secretaries of defense have suggested a new round of base realignment and closure. Fred Bartels is a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, writing about this in Strategic Studies Quarterly. Fred, thanks very much for coming on the program. What's the gist of the problem with BRAC? Is it just Congress at this point?
Thanks for having me, Francis. I really appreciate it. Well, it is what is stopping a BRAC round to go anywhere. So, as you mentioned in your intro, since 2011, every Secretary of Defense has requested for a new round of BRAC in their budget submission, and since then they have always been denied. Since then, you also have two studies that have looked at the infrastructure capacity of DoD, and one found out that they had 22% of excess capacity. The other one that it had 19% of excess capacity. Also, a third study is due in February 2020 with the 21 budget submission. So this would be the best case that DoD will have in the near future to make a case for a new round of BRAC.
The argument that Congress always gives, well, two main arguments that Congress gives in response to these requests over the past 8 years. One is that what if we need that capacity at some point in the future and we have to rebuild what we've already gotten rid of? And the other is the 2005 round, the most recent round, didn't wind up saving money, in fact wound up costing money. What did you find as you examined both of those, Fred?
So those are indeed the two main arguments that I hear against it. And the interesting thing to know on the first one is that you might need the capacity or not. I wrote a piece for CSIS at the end of last year on their really funny Bad Ideas in National Security series. That is one aspect that people bring up, but it doesn't really work, because if you look at BRAC, it usually reduces just 5% of the excess capacity. If you have 20% excess capacity, you would reduce that to around 15. That means that you still have that room for growth, unless there's some very specific and niche capability that you need on the base. And that's why BRAC is so important, because it's the only process that allows you to look holistically at all your bases across the services. On a day-to-day on the regular day-to-day operations of DoD, each service only looks at their bases and what their bases need. During BRAC, all the services and all the bases are looked at from a holistic perspective, and they can assess military value on all the bases and see how it can be realigned and reconnect to better generate military value. On the second question about investments, that's the problem is that BRAC, not the problem, the feature of BRAC is that it takes away permanent and recurring costs. So if you suppose that you have a Corvette and you change it for a Prius, you're always going to save on gas, because you now have a car that runs for longer with the same amount of gas. And you need to invest to change that Corvette for a Prius. And that's the upfront cost that Congress usually looks at, but they don't look at the other costs that you have permanent savings. And those permanent savings have been calculated by DoD, by GAO, and they hover around, for the 2005 BRAC round, it took longer than expected, but now it has been generating savings for a few years. And it's estimated that a new round of BRAC would save around $2 billion annually on recurring costs. So depending, the whole thing is that it's kind of like a mortgage. It takes a while for you to pay off, but you're going to have that solid investment.
Once it's paid off, the money's gone forever. You're not obligated to that money forever for as long as that lasts.
Exactly. You're not going to be incurring maintenance costs on bases that you have closed. Quite the opposite. The community is going to have access to that land that was behind gates before.
Is this something that you expect to see more action on from the department, given that Secretary Esper has said he's not going to waste any time in getting into this review of costs all across the department? He's going to apply the same kind of night court principles to the entire department that he applied as Secretary of the Army.
Exactly. I hope so. If I had the Secretary's ear, the one thing that I would tell him is that he needs to make a solid and concrete case in this infrastructure capacity review that is due in February, and actually go to Congress before you have the infrastructure review released, so they can address any concerns that they might have. Because what has happened with the last two infrastructure capacity reports is that Congress just nitpicked things and said, oh, no, we don't like this force structure. Can you go back and do again with a different force structure? Oh, we don't like the type of distribution of forces that you use. So those are things that can be worked out before. So it has a product that at least the big four would be more amenable to it.
How specific or how prescriptive has the department been, and maybe how specific and prescriptive should it be about which bases, which installations should be closed, and where the resources that are based there should go?
So that's an interesting aspect that has on this last infrastructure capacity report. The big change is that it required DoD to be more specific about geographical distribution, and this is a problem that usually DoD tries to avoid, that specificity, because it can depress real estate markets. And just because you're on a base that has excess capacity, that doesn't mean that that base is going to be closed. It might be a base that has unique weather, or it has unique runway access that is very valuable for the department. And by identifying the excess capacity there, it means that you might be able to move more missions in that base. So just because there's excess, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And having those bases and that geographical distribution listed can affect the real estate market in ways that might not be true.
Fred, thanks very much for coming on. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Francis.